Great. Thank you so much, Heike, for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. I am going to be talking about work that I did over the last decade or so based in Maine, thinking about historical ecology, but also thinking about the ways in which current lobster fishermen and lobstering communities are thinking about climate and adaptation to warming waters in this part of the world. And yes, I think there are lots of overlaps between the lobster fishery in Maine and Nova Scotia, and I think also some differences as well. I wanted to just start by describing the lobster fishery in Maine and really emphasizing the degree to which it dominates the culture of the coast of Maine. I really don't think this can be overstated. These images come from a variety of different places, including the Maine Lobster Festival, which happens each year in Rockland, Maine, and other images coming from the tourism industry in general. And so Maine has really done a great job of branding itself as the home of lobster and drawing people to the coast in the summer to enjoy lobster and the associated festivities that come along with that. Lobster also is really dominant economically along the coast of Maine. This is a graph, a figure that some of my students at Colby put together, showing the concentration of value in terms of landings of lobster along the coast. And we can see there's a couple of places that really are centered here, but it is important all up and down the coast. And importantly, it supports communities that have very little other economic activity. So tourism does exist all up and down the coast, but in some places more than others. And lobster is super important, particularly in places where there isn't a booming tourism industry. It's a very valuable fishery as well. It's not just important locally, it is the most valuable fishery in North America. And in Maine, it produces almost 90% of the value of the fishery. So it really is the biggest game in town. And outside of the state of Maine, the lobster fishery has also gotten attention for a number of different reasons. It's been noted as an archetype for a number of major issues in marine fisheries. For example, the history of co-management success. And so it has been frequently used as an example of successful co-management by folks like Eleanor Ostrom and others, describing the ways in which the co-management structure, which involves the federal government, the state government, and the lobster fishermen themselves, the ways in which that's been effective at protecting lobster and protecting the increased catch of lobster that we've seen over time. So for example, Jim Atchison wrote the classic book, The Lobster Gangs of Maine, which described the territoriality that lobster fishermen have that enhances and underscores the spatial management that exists at the state level. And this has gone back in time. For example, this news clipping from the 1940s talking about the trap cutting war that was going on at that time. And still to this day, there's areas that lobster fishermen know that they fish and exclude others from fishing. So this is part of the co-management success. Another part of the co-management success is the conservation buy-in that the lobster fishing community has had. So for example, the practice of V-notching gravid females, which is shown here. So if a female with eggs is caught, the fisherman will cut a notch in the tail fin. And this indicates that this is a reproductively successful animal, and she's thrown back and then is protected through successive molts until that V-notch grows out of her carapace. And so this practice was originated among lobster fishermen and became law within the state of Maine, and is something that the fishermen have been quite proud of and have strong buy-in. And so the lobster management success, these couple of examples of the ways that that's been supported, are really in stark contrast to many other fisheries, and especially the cod fishery, which, as I'm sure most folks know, crashed in this part of the world alongside at the same time as the rise of lobster. So in Eastern Canada, the shutdown, the moratorium of cod in 1992 deemed the biggest layoff in Canadian history. Here in the US, or at least where I was doing this work in the US, similarly, the crash of cod and the management by National Marine Fisheries Service caused serious problems as well. And so the comparison in terms of the management response and the management structure around cod and lobster has been made as well. So the idea that the strong co-management of lobster developed, learning some of the lessons perhaps that came out of the history of cod crash. So, so there is definitely a management component of this success, I think, but there's also a lot more going on here. And so the lobster fishery is also an archetype for the idea of fishing down the food web. So this same graph that I've been showing you in this slide here with the crash of cod and the rise of lobster can be interpreted very differently. The management story is not the full story. And the full story involves history and the historical ecology. So this work came out of some of the early HMAP projects that Heike mentioned at the beginning, out of the University of New Hampshire, looking at the history of cod along the Scotian Shelf, and showing that these the recent history that I've been showing you these graphs up until this point is really the very tail end of a long, productive history for cod. And so these crashes that show up here since the 1980s or so are really just noise if you look back over time. And so this estimate that there was an order of magnitude more cod on the Scotian Shelf a century ago by Andy Rosenberg and colleagues, I think is a really nice example of how, when we look farther back in time, we can see that these ecosystems functioned completely differently. And so for cod, we know that there was fishing along the coast here on these productive offshore banks. This is what drew Europeans to this part of the world initially. And set up these fishing communities along the coastlines here. So these really productive offshore banks like the Grand Banks and Scotian Shelf and Georges Bank, but then also fishing in these inshore areas, for example, in the Gulf of Maine. And so I like to show these images here because I think they really represent the ways that this ecosystem and the communities that depended on it changed over time. So these are cod that were caught in various locations along the coast of Maine. This image here of a man holding a cod caught on Monhegan Island, which is a small island in the Penobscot Bay. And then this image of cod caught in Frenchman's Bay as well, demonstrating the extreme productivity in these inshore areas. And notably, no cod have been caught in many of these inshore bays in more than a decade. And this loss highlights a loss of spatial complexity. So there used to be a whole lot more fishing in these inshore grounds. So work by Karen Alexander, who was based at UNH as part of this group at the time, demonstrated that there were many inshore grounds. So the average distance that a fisherman would go to catch cod in the 1860s was something like 24 kilometers as compared to an average distance of more than 100 kilometers today. In this map here, showing what some of those grounds were called and where they were located along the coast. And this corresponds, this spatial complexity in the fishery, of course, corresponds to spatial complexity in the fish populations themselves. And so Ted Ames, shown here, is a retired fisherman who has produced a great wealth of knowledge around this part of the world as well, his work earning him a MacArthur Genius Award. And this image here from one of his papers showing the results of surveys of retired fishermen indicating that these inshore bays were incredibly productive in terms of cod spawning. And so his work showed that half of these coastal spawning grounds, shown here in red, have disappeared. And so it's not just about cod. Cod are important, but the loss of cod also indicates a loss of ecological complexity. So cod are predators and they have to be supported by lots of prey to thrive in these numbers. And so some of the work, some of the historical ecology work here showed that these cod populations were supported by productive food webs, including things like herring and menhaden and clams. And Karen Alexander saying, to me, the most amazing thing we've learned is how incredibly productive these inshore banks were. And so if we fast forward to today and contrast those inshore banks with what we observe, it's a really very different system. So this is an image taken from the water near where I used to live, showing one lobster boat and then all of these lobster buoys, all of these colorful bits or buoys that are attached to lobster pots, traps that are actively catching lobster. And so the lobster fishery really occupies these inshore waters spatially. And I think this image really represents the degree to which these waters are just full of lobster and full of lobster, full of the lobster fishery as well. And so the ecological story and one of the reasons I think that the lobster has increased so much and has thrived so thoroughly has to do with the overfishing of cod and other groundfish predators. And so the top-down effects of fishing have been in part a release from predation, so the direct consumption of lobster by cod, and also a reduction in what's been called the landscape of fear. And so the ability of lobsters to walk out from under their rocks without fear of predation has facilitated range expansions potentially in this area and has helped to increase the lobster populations overall. So this work shown here is originally done by John Grabowski and colleagues, showing that in areas that still have more robust predatory fish populations, like in offshore ledges, the attack rate of lobsters is much higher, whereas where they are not present in inshore areas, the lobster populations are safer and feel safer. So there's the top-down effect of fishing in terms of this predation, and then there's also I think really important bottom-up effect of fishing that exists in the lobster fishery. So the lobster fishery is conducted using baited traps. And so the traps will be baited with things like herring, and there are escape vents on the traps that juvenile lobsters can go in and out of. And this bait has been shown to subsidize the lobster diets as juveniles and enhance the lobster growth. And so some have thought of this as a sort of pseudo aquaculture system. It's still a wild caught fishery, but this act of feeding the lobsters as they grow has been likened to a sort of simplified aquaculture system. So all of this is to say that the lobster fishery today exists in a really highly simplified ecological system. There's this fishing down the food web and the predator release, and then there's this use of bait to feed the lobsters. And in addition to this, and sort of alongside of this, the lobster fishery also exists in a highly simplified social system. And so this is a graph showing the landed value of fisheries in the state of Maine. And we can see that lobster, which is the dark green, is the most important and has been increasingly important over time. And this is a result of serial depletions, not just overfishing of cod, which I've talked about, but things like sea urchins, which had a boom and bust fishery in the 1990s, and a number of other fisheries. So as a result of these serial depletions, the lobster really dominates. And this also means that there are fewer fisheries left for diversification. And so if the lobster fishery were to crash, there would be fewer options for fishermen to move into. And there's also a management component to this as well. So it's not just a story of overfishing, but it's also a story of access. So for example, in the cod fishery, the license consolidation that's happened has meant that even were cod to recover in the state of Maine, the access that lobster fishermen would potentially have to that would be severely reduced. Most of those licenses have moved out of state. And so there's a real sense that, that lobster is the last and only game in town if we're talking about wild caught fisheries. And this has been called by Bob Stenick and others the gilded trap. So there's a sense that this fishery is very valuable. It is very valuable. There are fewer options to move into than there have been in the past, fewer diversification options and much less diversified fishery. And so this causes high capital investment in these fisheries in the form primarily of large, expensive fishing boats, and then tax incentives to reinvest in that fishery year after year. So thinking about these key drivers of the Maine lobster fishery, we have this very real history of co-management success, but then we also have that existing in the context of both ecological and social simplification of that fishery. And then there's climate change. So all of this has happened in the backdrop as the Gulf of Maine and other coastal waters warm. This is a story that I think is true around the world. The Gulf of Maine has been noted as a sort of test case for the effects of warming waters on marine fisheries, though, because it's been noted that it's warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. So far, this warming has actually been seen to benefit Maine lobster fisheries. And so this graph here showing that increased landings of lobster over this time scale. This sort of increase in fisheries landings is relatively unique. I think this idea that I'm showing you a graph in a fisheries talk of the landings going up and up and up. And I think the idea that that's not, given what we know about the history of global fisheries, not sustainable. And there are other factors at work. And so this paper by Good et al. From a couple of years ago, showing these landings broken down into two parts of the Gulf of Maine, the Southwest and the Northeast, and showing that the majority of that increase in landings is coming from the Northeast region, which is warming more slowly and is lagging the southern waters. And so this is an indication that sustained increase is likely to not be sustained for a whole lot longer. And this is not something that is a shocking revelation. This has been covered in a variety of different places. This idea that crashes are widely expected, for example, covered in the New York Times with this headline, "Climate change brought a lobster boom, and now it could cause a bust." And so the lobster fishery is now emerging as an archetype for climate adaptation, along with these other issues that I've started us off with. And so these climate impacts on the Maine lobster fishery have shown up in global news sources like the New York Times and the Washington Post that give you a version of this story that I've just told. So the fishery is overcapitalized, a collapse is on the horizon, we're sort of existing on borrowed time. With the message that climate impacts are real and adaptation in this fishery is needed. But adaptation in any particular fishery doesn't depend on New York Times reporters writing about it. It depends on local stakeholders deciding that this is something worth their time and buying into thinking about adaptation. And so one component of this and one important piece of it is the view of those stakeholders of the impact of warming waters directly on their fisheries. And so the talk that I want to give to you today and the research that I want to talk about has to do with this idea of the stakeholders' views of warming waters impacts on fisheries. And so this is research that touches on a variety of different things that I've been involved with over the last few years and involves both interview-based research as well as archival research. From thinking about this from the historical ecology perspective. And so I'll talk through three main questions. The first, how do stakeholders prioritize warming waters? And then what makes fishers likely to adapt? And then thinking about the role of history in shaping adaptation. We'll dive into the archives for that piece of it. So the interviews that we conducted with stakeholders had two main components. The first took a mental modeling approach to quantify lobster fishers and scientists' views of the lobster fishery. And so mental models are essentially individuals' internal representations of their world, however that's defined. So thinking about the components of that system, the relationships among those components, and then the strength of those relationships. And then we paired this with in-depth interviews that we wanted to use to help understand perceptions of the drivers of change and fishers' adaptations to warming waters. And so the mental models that we constructed included the key components of the lobster fishery. So for example, commercial fisheries and lobster populations were two of those components. The relationships among those components, whether and how they affected each other, and then the strength of each relationship. So the degree to which one of those concepts is thought to influence the other. And we conducted these mental models using a two-stage interview process. So the first stage was sitting down with lobster fishermen and asking them to draw on a piece of paper the key concepts that they saw within the lobster fishery. And so this is an example of one of those hand-drawn mental models. And this person has shown the increase of water temperatures here in the center linked to a number of different concepts, one of those being lobster. And we can see that this is shown in this case as being perhaps both a positive and a negative impact on lobsters. And so we conducted interviews like this until we had a consistent representation of the concepts, and then we boiled those down and did more quantitative interviews. And so this was the form that we used for that second stage, which was the quantitative interview process. And so we can see we ended up with 8 different concepts that are shown both along the top and along the side. And the interview process involved asking folks what they thought each of those relationships looked like. And the results of that look like this. And so before I tell you what our results are, I wanted to talk through what the mental model is showing and what the components of that to look out for are. And so these are 8 different concepts, each of them represented by a circle. The size of the circle represents the centrality or the relative importance in that person or that community's mind of that concept relative to the 7 other concepts. The gray lines between the circles represent positive interaction. So meaning that if one concept increases, say if lobster populations increase, the response that that person would expect in another one of those concepts. So if lobster populations increase, for example, commercial fisheries might be thought to increase as well. And then red lines are the opposite of that. So negative interaction. So if one concept increases, the other would be thought to decrease. The line width indicates the strength of the interaction, and each of those symbols corresponds with numerical results. In the talk that follows, I'm not going to focus so much on those numbers, but just know that each of the widths of the arrows and the size of the circles represents a number. And then finally, I'm going to be talking primarily about the drivers, so how these different communities think about the main forces acting within the lobster fishery. And so those drivers are displayed along the top of the mental models here, and those are warming coastal waters, pollution, and management. And in terms of the stakeholder views of these 3 drivers, we'll be comparing the fishing community with scientists who have been involved with the lobster fishery in the state of Maine. So this is now the fishing community's mental model. And one thing to note here, one of the first things that we noted is that management actions are viewed as largely positive. So there are positive reciprocal relationships with fisheries. We see lots of gray lines coming out of this management circle. And within the context of fisheries management, I think this is notable. So the fishing community who are subject to the management actions think that those are largely positive and think that those are beneficial to the lobster populations, to commercial fisheries, and to other aspects of the lobster system that they are involved with. And scientists agree. So scientists and the fishing community both agree that management is strong. And this, I think, is due to the last decade or two of really active work that's happened in the state of Maine to enhance the co-management system that was already strong in this part of the world. Warming waters, conversely, were viewed as negative. So now if we move our attention over to this part of the mental model, we see lots of red And this is indicating that there are negative impacts that are perceived across the system. And so again, this is the fishing community's mental model, and it's not substantially different from the scientists. Scientists also view warming waters as important and negatively impactful. But there is a difference, which is that the warming water driver was the most important for scientists and the least important for the fishing community. So of these three drivers, the scientists viewed warming waters as for sure the most important, whereas fishermen were focusing their attention in other places, in particular on pollution and management actions as having a bigger impact than warming coastal waters. And then finally, pollution was also viewed as negative by both groups. In this case, this is the fishing community's mental model, and we can see that it was, again, negative across the system, and it's the most important driver within the fishing community. Again, scientists agree pollution is bad, but they don't think it's as important at all. It's the least important driver among scientists. So there's a difference in the prioritization of these drivers among these two communities, which I think is useful in understanding differences in views. And then another interesting thing that came out of this when we paired this with the more in-depth interviews was that definitions of pollution differed among these groups. And so lobster fishermen tended to think about pollution as debris or sort of a larger category of things influencing this driver of pollution, whereas scientists identified fewer things and uniquely identified CO2 as a pollutant in the Gulf of Maine. So not only are they saying warming coastal waters is the most important driver, they're saying that part of pollution is actually climate change. And so warming coastal water and pollution are more linked in the minds of scientists than we originally thought going into this process. And this matches with overall concern about climate change. So we also asked these two groups what their concern was about climate change. And so scientists by and large were very concerned. So 90% of scientists were very concerned about climate change, whereas lobster fishermen were more split. Some lobster fishermen were in fact very concerned or somewhat concerned about climate change, and others viewed it as less or not at all important in their lives. Then one other important piece of this mental modeling had to do with the question of the ecosystem itself. And so you might have noticed when I showed you this this survey tool at the beginning of this section of the talk, that there were some of these concepts that had these fill in the blank areas. And so what we did is ask people before we started the formal mental modeling what they considered to be the most important predator of lobsters and what was the most important prey. And we expected and got answers like this. So for example, cod and other groundfish is one answer that somebody gave as the most important predator, or mussels and herring was another example of something that was expected and something that we got on the survey in terms of most important prey. What we didn't necessarily expect when we set this up, but should have perhaps, was that some people answered the most important predator and prey questions with humans. So when we asked what the most important predator was, some people said people or fishing. And when we asked what the most important prey was, people sometimes said bait. And so this was really interesting. And I think set up some opportunities to look at the different ways that that people view this system and humans' role in this system as perhaps more complex than we had initially gone into this as thinking about. And so when we compared these views, there are sort of four different views that come out of this. So the idea that the system is natural, meaning that the predator and the prey are both naturally occurring in this system. Both scientists and fishers had this view to an equal extent. So about 20 to 30% of folks thought that the system was, the lobster system was more or less natural. And then similarly, the groups tended to agree with these views of full aquaculture. So answering both that the most important predator was fishing and humans, and the most important prey was bait. The difference came in when we looked at this mixed situation where the answers differed. And so what came out of this is that the fishing community places much more importance on bait. So they're much more likely to answer that the most important predator wasn't humans, that it was something naturally occurring, but that bait was the most important prey. And scientists were very, very unlikely to hold this view. And then conversely, scientists tended to view humans more often as predators. So answering that the most important predator was the fishermen themselves, and that the most important prey was something naturally occurring. So discounting the role of bait in this system. And so I think this points to a really interesting difference in the ways that these two groups are viewing fishing as impacting the system. So scientists tend to have this more traditional view of humans as impacting the fishery through extraction, through effort, therefore potentially impacting populations, which I think is sort of a traditional view of fisheries. If you fish the fish populations, they go down. Whereas fishermen don't necessarily hold this view, and in fact, they think in some cases, like in this case of baiting the fishery, that humans potentially are augmenting the fishery, or at least decoupling the act of fishing from depletion through this act of this bottom-up impact of feeding lobsters through bait. So thinking about the questions that we started off with, the key results to keep in mind so far is that the fishing community prioritizes warming waters less than other drivers of change. And they actually view some human activities as benefiting the fishery, in particular baiting lobster traps. So I want to turn now to this second question here of what makes fishers likely to adapt. And so we asked in our interviews a series of questions around adaptation. So we asked, have you observed warming waters? Do you think warming waters will affect the fishery? Do you think warming waters will affect you personally? And do you have plans to adapt? And we got sort of decreasingly positive responses to this series of questions. So nearly all folks had observed warming waters and think it will affect the fishery, but fewer thought that it would affect them personally, and only about half had stated plans to adapt. And so this begged the question of the differences that exist between individuals within the lobster community that said that they had plans to adapt and those who didn't. And so I dove into the adaptation literature and read a bunch about this when I was doing this work, and indicated that there were individual psychosocial traits that tend to be important in understanding when people within resource-dependent communities make a choice to adapt. And so this gap between adaptive capacity, do you have the ability to adapt, to move into other, in this case, potentially other fisheries, and do you make that actual choice to adapt? And so we wanted to look at those two groups and ask what differences existed between those who had plans and those who did not. And so one of the things that came out of this is that individuals who had these stated plans to adapt acknowledged greater anthropogenic threat across the board. So for example, they're more worried about climate change. Their response to the concern over climate change looks much more like scientists. So this is showing the lobster fishermen who don't have plans to adapt versus those who do. And so those who do are 80% of them are very or somewhat concerned about climate change, as compared to about 14% of those who don't. And it's not just about climate change, they're also concerned about other things as well. So their mental models show more negative impacts of warming waters across the whole system. They're also more concerned about pollution. And they're also more likely to have a view that's similar to scientists with respect to this impact of humans within this fishery system. So they're more likely to view humans as the most important predator, so that humans are negatively impacting lobster populations through fishing. So overall, people who have a sense of greater anthropogenic threat are saying that they have these plans to adapt. They also, interestingly, have a greater sense that they can influence management. So we asked lobster fishermen, do you feel like you can influence fisheries decisions? And those who have plans to adapt to a much greater degree, answered yes to that question. So these individuals who have plans to adapt also think that they have agency in a positive way within this functioning co-management system. So these individuals have who have plans to adapt have a greater sense of human agency, both negatively in terms of their threat perception from warming waters and pollution, and this idea that humans, the act of fishing, also is a potential threat to this system. So coupling a fishing effort to lobster populations. Then they also have this greater sense of human agency positively within this co-management system, feeling that they have an ability to connect with those who are making decisions and influence those decisions. So then in the rest of my talk, I want to turn to this second question of what is the role of history in shaping adaptation? And for this component of the talk, I'm going to move away from the interview-based research and think about what the archives can tell us about thinking about adaptation in this particular fishery. And so if you remember, within the mental models, warming waters fell below other threats in terms of how fishermen were viewing this system. And in our in-depth interviews, people would say things to support that, like it fluctuates every year and there are historical peaks and valleys to it. And so this begged the question of why are there these perceptions that it fluctates and there are historical peaks and valleys, and particularly in contrast with some of the things that I started off by telling you in terms of the overall perception of this, that it's this really sort of unidirectional crisis. The climate, the warming waters and climate change in this part of the world is going to wipe out these communities in a generation. And the people in those communities saying, you know, it goes up, it goes down, it's gone up and it's gone down in the past. So what are reasons for that? One of those reasons is that it has, in fact, gone up and down in the past. The fishers are right. This is a graph showing the temperature anomaly in the Gulf of Maine since the 1860s. And we see this period since the late 1990s of warm water temperature anomalies. But then we also see a period in the 1940s and 1950s of higher than average temperatures for about a decade and a half. And those were followed right away by colder than average temperatures. So these are the historical peaks and valleys that the fishermen are talking about when they're saying that warming waters are less of a priority because they have this memory of these changes. And these stories of water temperatures impacts on fisheries are also something that are accessible through archives. And so periodicals like the Maine Coast Fisherman, which was published beginning in the 1940s, the Atlantic Fisherman, published over the same timescale, and then the National Fisherman, which actually represents a consolidation of these two publications and continuation to this day, record a number of different things about the fishery, including things like rapid temperature change and the effects of those temperature changes on fisheries. And so these were periodicals that were largely written by and for the fishing community. So reading them gives a sense of the issues that are on the minds of people involved in these fisheries over time. And so we dove into these into this archive and read thousands and thousands of stories about the impacts of warming waters and cooling waters on fisheries over time. And they showed up in lots of different ways. So here are some examples of the observed fisheries impacts of historical warming on fisheries in the state of Maine. So for example, in 1953, part of this warming period, there was an article that reported on soft shell lobsters or shutters being caught as early as the middle of May, the earliest any of the fishermen can remember. The warm winters are blamed for the early catch of shutters. And this phenomenon of early shedding is one that was seen recently in 2012 that caused big impacts on the lobster fishery. And it's something that has been seen as well in this period, was seen as well in this period of warming waters. So this early onset of molting due to a warm winter. Another example of a news article that we pulled out of this archive came from 1950, and it described the European oyster being experimentally held surviving this warm winter 1949 to 1950 relatively well. And so this is an example of potential benefit of these warming waters. And so we pulled out lots and lots of different news stories like this, and we coded them in two different ways. So we coded them by the type of impact, whether it had to do with increase, like that story about the oysters that I just mentioned, whether it had to do with scarcity, access, or condition. So the four different bins that we put these articles into. And then we also coded them in terms of whether they were perceived as positive to the fishing industry, whether they were perceived as neutral, if it was just a news story that didn't have any stated benefit or impact, negative impact on the fishery, and then whether they were perceived as negative. And we compared these across those three different periods of rapid temperature change. So this historical warming period in the 1940s and early 1950s, the historical cooling period in the 1960s, and then this modern warming period beginning in the late 1990s. And so the results that I'm going to show you are all binned into those three different time periods, and I'll be showing you the type of impact in the top here, and then the perception of the impact on the bottom. And so thinking about that historical warming period, most of the stories that we read in and collected from that time period had to do with fisheries increase. So for example, this article from 1947 saying the temperature of water has been just a little above average this summer, and all indications are that it's been an excellent season for spawning of shellfish. A warm fall will mean their continued growth, giving them a better chance of survival. And by and large, these warming water stories were either positive or neutral, and to a lesser extent viewed as, this warming water was not as often viewed as negative within the fishery. As compared to the modern warming, which was most often linked to scarcity. So for example, from 2013, the Gulf of Maine shrimp went into a stock collapse that triggered the first total shutdown of the winter fishery since 1978. Hopes for a return may be dashed by warming average water temperatures in the Gulf, pushing shrimp farther north and east. And overwhelmingly, modern warming was viewed as a negative impact on the fishery. And then finally, the historical cooling was most often linked to scarcity and access. So for example, this article from 1957, the continued cold weather hindered any really good fishing and catches have been generally small. And by and large, these were, the historical cooling was viewed as negative to an equal extent as the modern warming. And so what this looks like in this part of the world primarily is ice in the winter. So this decreased access due to historical cooling led to things like boats being frozen at the dock. This image here showing that, and these set of quotes here from 1959 describing sheltered harbors, coves, and inlets frozen over with ice nearly a foot thick that left small longliners and other inshore craft jammed and the inshore fishery practically at a standstill. And so these images of this extreme cold and freezing are often extremely impactful and quite visual. And so a number of these articles were accompanied by images such as these, and these are really place specific. So particular bays that were frozen over that people are used to seeing as water. These images of boats being frozen in place. And so I think these images and stories of freezing events in particular locations have long cultural longevity, which potentially amplifies this belief that this warming water is temporary. And I think these extreme or surprising events stick in people's minds in ways that the sort of slower warming that has less of this visual impact don't really do that. So this question of what accounts for this conflict in belief structure between this sort of outside view that it's going to be gone in a generation and views that some hold within the fishery that it fluctuates has to do in part with these local memories of this climate history and the images and the stories that come from particular places, in particular of these extreme and surprising freezing and cold events. And so I want to finish up by thinking about how this idea of climate history relates to the question of adaptation. And to do that, I want to step out of this really place-specific story I've been telling you and think about the question of these surprising events more globally. And so I want to talk about a project that I was involved with that was led by Andy Pershing, who is at the time based at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, which looked at surprising temperature events around the world. And what this project did was to quantify those surprises. So those moments in history where temperatures surprised the people in these coastal regions. And the way that this was done was by quantifying the number of large marine ecosystems with annual temperatures 2 standard deviations, either above or below the mean for the previous 30 years. And so these graphs that I'll show you show the number of surprised large marine ecosystems over time beginning around 1900. And so what we can see here is that surprising warming and surprising cooling were both relatively rare. No more than 3 large marine ecosystems experienced these surprises in the same year in this early part of the time series. However, this warming that I described for the Gulf of Maine in the 1940s was more widespread. And so it led to an increase in the number of surprised regions in the 1940s. But then this levels out after this regional warming and remained relatively low through the 1980s. And then in the 1990s, and especially after 1998, we see this increase in warm surprises after this time period, and there are only 4 cold surprises since 2000. So we see this increase in warming and predictions, of course, that is going to increase through time. So these global data show that this extreme warming is increasing while cooling is not. And I think this relates to the place-specific story that I've been telling you, in that it suggests that these historical experiences are perhaps becoming less relevant in the context of these changes that have happened in these surprising temperatures over the last century or so, and suggests that to be successful, institutions like management agencies and businesses will need to think about adopting strategies that look forward rather than backward. And that adaptation based on past experiences, well, based on observations and rational thought, is becoming diminishingly effective in this era of unprecedented change. So thinking now about what we can take away from this series of stories about the Maine lobster fishery, I think the first is that Maine lobster fishermen have observed warming waters, but many of them are not planning to adapt to those warming waters. But that within that community, individual responses vary, and those who plan to adapt have a greater sense of human agency, both in terms of the impacts that people have, but also the ability of humans to get together and affect change. I think one important piece of this that comes out is that beliefs having to do with warming waters are rational. They're linked to this real historical memory of temperature fluctuations that existed in this part of the world and that are part of the cultural memory of people living and working in these systems. But they may inhibit adaptation in this era of unprecedented change, as the past may not be as effective as it has been in making decisions about what to do moving forward. And so I think this leads to the conclusion, one of the conclusions, that local views matter. So climate history affects current values and future planning, and in a variety of different ways. And one of those is that these local experiences of climate history have cultural longevity. In particular, things like these frozen over bays that are really rooted in people's minds. And so these diverse values about climate adaptation are often locally rooted, and they are rational, based on real observations. And so these conflicts that exist in lots of different places at these different scales, local, regional, and within these different belief structures at these different scales, from local to global, do exist, and I think they can be understood. And I think this example is one that shows what some of those the roots of some of those conflicts might be. And then I think a second conclusion to take away from this is that differences within communities matter. So from adaptation literature from a variety of different places, including fisheries, but also thinking about polar communities and adapting to wildfires, I think the idea that community level adaptation may hinge on individuals who take a greater concern in these systems in terms of human impacts and greater engagement with management is true perhaps across these systems. And so that these individual psychosocial traits that relate to different levels of engagement with adaptation mean that adaptation will tend to depend on leaders and key individuals within those communities to take action. Okay, and with that, thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with the discussion.